The seat that wasn't just a seat, the glass doors of the VIP lounge slid open with a soft hiss, letting in a cool breeze of air-conditioned silence. Zoe Williams, just 8 years old, stepped inside with a kind of quiet confidence that came, not from arrogance, but from a place deep inside, a foundation built by love, lessons, and a father who had always told her, "You belong everywhere your feet choose to walk." Her small hand clutched a leather backpack that was slightly too big for her shoulders, and a worn copy of Hidden Figures peeked from the side pocket, its pages curled from use. Her hair was braided neatly in cornrows, tied at the ends with purple. Ribbons her favorite color. Everything about her was proper, precise, and polite. She wore her best travel dress, a navy blue cotton shift with small white polka dots and freshly shined shoes. She didn't look like someone lost. She looked like someone going somewhere. Zoe made her way to the reception desk, walking past sleek leather chairs and businessmen glued to their laptops. She stepped up on her toes, barely tall enough to see over the marble counter, and gave a bright smile to the woman standing behind it. "Hi, I'm Zoe Williams. I'm traveling to Chicago today as an unaccompanied minor. My dad booked me a first-class ticket. It says I have access to the lounge." She held up her printed papers. Carefully, like treasure, the woman at the desk, Patricia, her name tag read, looked down slowly, then raised one eyebrow. She glanced at Zoe, then at the papers, then back at Zoe. Her lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice dipped in syrup and suspicion. "This lounge is for first class. Passengers only." Zoe didn't flinch. Her father had prepared her for this kind of moment. "Yes, ma'am. It says here I'm in seat 2A. I'm traveling alone, but my documents say I'm allowed access here." She pointed clearly to the part that listed the lounge benefits. Patricia gave a stiff nod, but picked up the phone and turned her back slightly, whispering to someone on the other end, "Yes, we have a situation, a minor claiming lounge access." "No, traveling alone. Yes, first class." I know. She hung up, made 2 more calls, and only then, after a good 15 minutes, finally handed Zoe back her papers with a tight smile. "You can stay." "Over there," she gestured to a corner by the window, far from the central seating. "We'll bring you some juice." Zoe walked to the corner table without a word. She opened her book and sat tall. She knew what just happened, but she wouldn't cry. Her father's voice echoed in her heart. Let your dignity be the loudest thing in the room. So she didn't complain. She read. 2 hours later. Her flight was announced: Skyline Airways Flight 2275, nonstop to Chicago. Zoe stood, gathered her things, and headed to the gate. Again, she was stopped. Again, she was asked, "Are you sure?" Again, she showed her papers. Again, she was delayed while a gate agent called to confirm what was already in writing. By the time she was allowed to board, she was exhausted from defending her right to simply be where she belonged. When she stepped onto the plane, the first class flight attendant, a young woman named Ashley, gave her a confused look. "Do you need help finding your seat in the back?" she asked without even checking the boarding pass. Zoe offered it calmly. "I'm in 2A, she said. Ashley blinked, looked down, and then back up. "Oh," she said, smile stiffening. "Right. This way." Zoe walked past the wide, cushy seats until she found hers, 2A, by the window, just as her dad promised. She placed her backpack under the seat, fastened her belt, and began to read again. She felt eyes on her, of course. Some passengers glanced and then looked away, others stared openly. But no one said anything until Victoria Harrington boarded. Victoria was the kind of woman who had never heard no without a legal battle following. Everything about her spoke of inherited privilege: her cream-colored Chanel suit, pearl earrings, and the faint scent of imported roses from her perfume. Behind her trailed Gregory Harrington, her husband, more absorbed in his phone than the world around him. As soon as Victoria spotted Zoe in seat 2A, she stopped dead in the aisle. "Gregory," she said, in a voice that wasn't exactly quiet, "why is a child sitting in my seat?" Gregory didn't even glance up. "What?" "That's I requested it specifically." It's the perfect view for takeoff, you know that. Why is that child? She paused. There, Gregory sighed. Your ticket says 4C, Victoria. Victoria scowled. That must be a mistake. She walked straight to the galley and pulled aside Ashley, who straightened as if summoned to court. Excuse me, Victoria said. I believe there's a seating error. There's a child in seat 2A, and I specifically requested that seat when I booked. Ashley hesitated. Actually, that young lady has a valid boarding pass for 2A. She's traveling as an unaccompanied minor. Victoria's lips pursed. You quite sure? It's unusual, isn't it? A child traveling alone in first class? She leaned in, lowering her voice. She must have wandered in from the back, a common mistake. Wouldn't want to make a scene, but... And then her hand slipped into her handbag and returned with a folded $100 bill. She slid it into Ashley's hand with the ease of long practice. You understand. My husband's firm spends millions with your airline every year. Surely there's a better place for her to sit. Ashley paused. The silence was long. The bill disappeared? She nodded. Within moments, another flight attendant, Derek, was brought over. Zoe was approached. Excuse me, sweetie, Ashley began, using that same sweet voice from before. There seems to be a mistake. We think you might be in the wrong seat. Zoe looked up, calm but confused. This is that's what my ticket says. Can we see it again? Derek asked, pretending it hadn't been shown several times already. Zoe handed it over. They stared at it, pretending something was wrong. She must have found that ticket somewhere, Victoria chimed in loudly. There's no way she belongs here, the murmurs began. A businessman in 1C muttered, Kids don't belong in first class anyway. A woman across the aisle rolled her eyes and said, What are they thinking these days? Zoe's chest tightened. She glanced around the cabin, searching for a kind face. Most passengers looked away. Some scowled. Only one woman, an older black lady with silver dreadlocks, looked at her kindly. She lifted her phone discreetly and began to record. Ashley leaned closer. For everyone's comfort, we'd like to move you to a different seat. It's not a problem. It'll be a nice seat in economy. My ticket is for 2A, Zoe replied, quietly but firmly. My father paid for this seat, Victoria huffed. Oh, please, this is ridiculous. Just move. Her so we can take off. Zoe's hands trembled. Please, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to sit where I'm assigned. But her voice was fading. The pressure was too much. Ashley's smile vanished. Derek stepped forward, reaching for her bag. We'll take you to the right seat now. Zoe stood up slowly. Her back straight. She didn't cry, not yet. She held her book tightly. She walked down the aisle in silence, head high, heart breaking. Victoria slid into the seat, smiling triumphantly. Much better, she sighed. Now we can finally have some peace. Mrs. Patterson lowered her phone and whispered to herself, They're about to learn the real meaning of turbulence. The call that shook the sky. Zoe walked down the narrow aisle of the airplane slowly, her shoes tapping softly against the carpet with every step that felt like 1,000 miles away from the dignity she had carried into this journey. The weight of judgment had settled on her shoulders like an invisible cloak, heavy and humiliating. She didn't glance back at the seat she had rightfully claimed, now occupied by a woman who had stripped her of more than just space. Victoria Harrington sat with her arms folded in satisfaction, her husband Gregory still oblivious, scrolling his emails as if nothing of consequence had happened. And for most of the passengers, it wasn't to them. This was routine and inconvenience corrected, a child removed from the grown-up world. But for Zoe, it was something else entirely. It was another lesson in how easily people could look away, how silence could scream just as loudly as words, and how power could be bought with something as small as a folded bill. Ashley escorted her to the economy section without a word of apology, and Derek, too ashamed to look her in the eye, placed her backpack in the overhead bin before gesturing to a window seat in the middle of the cabin. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't where she was supposed to be. Zoe sat down quietly and looked out the window, blinking quickly to keep the tears at bay. Her little hands fumbled for her tablet, not because she wanted to play a game, but because it held something far more powerful, her dad's number. Not many 8-year-olds knew how to email encrypted messages, but Marcus Williams had taught his daughter everything: how to travel alone, how to stay safe, how to be strong, and how to stand tall even when others tried to make her feel small. One of those lessons included a simple protocol: if anything ever feels wrong, if someone makes you feel less, message me. No drama, no fuss. Just send it. Zoe opened the email app and quietly typed 3 lines. Hey Dad, I'm on the plane. They moved me from seat 2A to the back. Said it was for comfort of others. A woman gave money to the flight attendant and took my seat. I didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't need to say more. She hit send, closed the tablet, and pulled her hoodie up over her head. It wasn't to sleep. It was to hide the fact that the tears had finally won. She turned her face to the window, watching the airport workers move about on the tarmac, wondering if any of them had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, just for existing in their own skin. 35,000 feet above the ground, silence wrapped around her like a heavy fog. No one in the economy cabin said anything cruel, but no one said anything kind either. To them, she was just another child, one of many. And yet, what none of them knew, not Victoria, not Ashley, not Derek or Gregory or the balding man in 1C, was that the email Zoe sent was about to cause a seismic shift from the sky to the boardrooms of Chicago. Marcus Williams was seated at the head of a long mahogany table on the 47th floor of Skyline Airways headquarters. The board meeting had just started, and his executive team was going over financial reports. Marcus, tall and composed in his dark tailored suit, with a steel-gray beard trimmed to perfection and eyes as sharp as a hawk's, listened carefully. He always listened. It was what had gotten him here, from loading cargo at night to negotiating billion-dollar deals. His mind was calculating profits, crew shortages, and fleet expansions when his smartwatch vibrated. He glanced down casually. The screen lit up. Zoe, to a woman paid to take seat. Crew moved me. His posture stiffened. The room kept talking. Charts were projected. Words like margins, stockholders, and market expansion filled the air. But all Marcus heard was the quiet voice of his daughter saying, "I didn't want to cause a scene." He stood up slowly, interrupting a mid-sentence forecast about Q3 earnings. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm but lined with steel. "I need to step out for a moment. Carry on without me." He walked out of the room, pulled out his phone, and dialed. Not his assistant. Not the PR team, not legal. He dialed direct. "Control. This is Marcus Williams. I need the real-time feed for flight 2275. Yes. Pull cabin footage. Begin at boarding through takeoff. Cross-reference with the crew manifest. Prioritize passenger interaction footage for seat 2A. I wanted all gate recordings, lounge entries. Onboard logs. Now." The control center scrambled into action. There were no delays when the CEO of the airline spoke. Within minutes, Marcus had access to multiple camera angles. He watched it all, Zoe at the lounge desk being questioned, the long delay at the gate, the way Ashley's demeanor changed after speaking to the woman in white, Victoria's smugness, the bill exchange, the crew's body language, and finally Zoe's removal. He paused the footage on her face just before she stood up, her eyes wide and hurt, filled with silent resistance. Something in him snapped, not with rage, but with purpose. He had built an airline where no one should ever be made to feel less than. He had hidden his daughter's identity on purpose, because he wanted her to walk through the world knowing that her value was not in his name, but in her own presence. And now the world had dared to test that belief. He pressed another number. "Get me Carol Ramirez, VP of Cabin Operations. Also, connect me to legal, and someone tell the internal ethics auditor to report directly to my office in 10 minutes. We're initiating a full audit of Flight 2275. Meanwhile, on board the flight, Zoe sat still, unaware that a storm had begun to form far beyond the clouds. Mrs. Patterson, still seated in first class, finally slipped her phone back into her purse and sat with her fingers folded in thought. She had seen injustice before, brutal, obvious, violent. But this was different. This was quiet prejudice, clean and covered in politeness, designed to be ignored by people who wanted to believe the world had moved on. She didn't know who Zoe was, but she knew what she had seen in that video. She had already uploaded it to her secure drive. She would send it to every advocacy group she knew, if needed. Because sometimes justice wasn't just loud. Sometimes it was silent and strategic, docked at the same time, in first class. Victoria reclined with a contented sigh, sipping champagne and scrolling through photos of yacht listings on her phone. "It's just a seat," she had told herself. No. Harm done. But the truth? She hadn't taken a seat. She had taken something else. And the turbulence that would follow wouldn't come from the sky. An hour later, in the control room at Skyline HQ, the full report was in. The timeline was verified. The flight crew's actions were confirmed. Audio recordings backed Zoe's. Email, even worse. They showed a pattern. Patricia in the lounge had a history of prior complaints, most buried. Ashley had once been written up for a similar comment to a South Asian family, and Derek had a training score that flagged for bias. In conflict resolution, Marcus read every page. Then, without a word, he stood and walked back into the boardroom where his executives had just finished presenting revenue projections. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, placing the file on the table, "we'll revisit the financials later. For now, we have something far more valuable to protect: our ethics, our culture, and the dignity of every passenger who flies with us. There has been an incident on Flight 2275. Effective immediately. I am grounding the lead flight crew pending investigation. The attendant team, the lounge manager, and the gate agent involved are suspended without pay." Heads turned. Whispers filled the room. But no one dared interrupt. Marcus continued, his voice now razor-sharp. "I want a memo sent to all senior staff before the plane lands. We will not allow prejudice, overt or disguised, to operate under our banner. I started this company from the bottom. I will not let it rot from the top. And one more thing, have my jet prepped. I'm flying to Chicago tonight. I'll meet the plane when it lands." Back in the sky, Zoe sat quietly, still unaware, but Mrs. Patterson noticed a change. The co-pilot came out. He glanced toward the back, nodded slightly, and walked back into the cockpit. Then Ashley received a message on her service tablet. Her face paled as she read it. She stepped away quickly, whispering to Derek. Something had changed, and when Zoe's flight touched down in Chicago just after sunset, there were already people waiting: Skyline staff, media vans, and standing silently in a dark coat by the gate with arms folded, Marcus Williams himself. His daughter walked out of the jet bridge, small and tired but still composed. She spotted her father, and only then did her shoulders finally lower. She ran to him, dropping her backpack, and he knelt to meet her halfway, pulling her into a hug that was more than just warmth, it was armor. "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered into her hair. "You were brave. You stood tall. And now the world's going to remember your name, not because of who your father is, but because of who you are." Zoe didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just held him tight. Behind them, Ashley, Derek, and Patricia were escorted off. The plane quietly by Skyline HR officers. Victoria Harrington followed moments later, confused by the number of flashing cameras waiting for her. As questions rained down about privilege, bribery, and discrimination, she began to realize that the seat she took had come at a price far greater than money, and the video? It was already trending by morning. The world saw her. The sun had just begun to dip behind the skyline of Chicago, casting a soft gold across the windows of O'Hare Airport, when Zoe and Marcus Williams walked out of the terminal hand in hand. What was supposed to be a quiet solo? Return flight for an 8-year-old had turned into something else entirely, something heavier, louder, and far bigger than Zoe could have ever imagined. She didn't speak much on the way to the Blacktown car waiting curbside, nor did her father force her to. His hand was warm, steady, grounding. She clutched it with the quiet pressure of a child still reeling from everything that had happened. though she didn't fully understand the magnitude not yet. All she knew was that she had been right, and still she had been dismissed. That hurt stayed in her bones like a bruise under her skin. Silent, lingering, and very real. Marcus opened the car door for her gently and helped her inside, then slid in beside her. "You hungry?" he asked softly, looking over at her. She shrugged a little. "Let's fix that first," he said, pulling out his phone. But before he could even call the driver to reroute them toward her favorite restaurant, his phone began to vibrate, once, twice, then again it didn't. Stop, news alerts, email pings, missed calls from journalists, private messages from board members, screenshots, links, tweets. The video had gone viral. The footage from Mrs. Patterson had already reached social media an hour before the flight touched down, and it exploded like wildfire the moment someone recognized the girl being removed from first class. Zoe Williams, the daughter of Marcus Williams, CEO of Skyline Airways. The headline was clickbait perfection. Black girl kicked from first class by flight crew, unaware her dad owns the airline. Another, little girl's VIP seat taken after white passenger pays off crew, turns out she's the CEO's daughter. Videos showed the moment Zoe was removed. The still frames, her small figure standing silently while grown adults loomed over her, were heartbreaking. The contrast was too stark to ignore. The pain too familiar. The truth too loud. By the time they pulled up to a quiet restaurant in the heart of the city, there were cameras already waiting. Not many, not yet, but enough to remind Marcus that this wasn't just a company issue anymore. This was personal, national, global. Zoe glanced up at the flashes and microphones, clutching her father's hand tightly, and for the first time, asked, "Why are they here?" Marcus knelt beside her. "Because you stood your ground, Zoe, and the world noticed." "But I didn't do anything," she said, confused. "No," he replied, brushing her braid behind her ear. "You didn't, and that's why it matters. They saw what happened to you. They saw you being pushed aside, and they're angry. Because they see their own daughters, their own little sisters, themselves, and they know it was wrong." Inside the restaurant, the manager had already cleared out a private room for them. Zoe sat quietly, her appetite returning slowly with the smell of her favorite dish, grilled cheese with tomato soup, and her father sat across from her with his laptop open. He was already drafting statements. Not PR fluff, not lawyer approved scripts, but truth. Marcus had always believed in doing business face-to-face with honesty and accountability. Tonight would be no different. But as he typed, his mind wasn't just focused on the fallout, it was focused on the future. Because what had happened wasn't new. Zoe was just one child among thousands, millions who had been made to feel lesser simply for existing in spaces not designed with them in mind. He wasn't just going to apologize. He was going to change something, starting with the very culture of the company he had built from nothing. The next morning, America woke up to the storm. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Morning shows led with clips of Zoe's silent resistance, followed by images of her father arriving at the terminal. Interviews with social justice advocates flooded social media. The hashtag #Seat2A began trending worldwide, not just as a story about airline injustice, but as a larger symbol of how even children weren't exempt from prejudice. And in that conversation, people didn't just see a black child being removed from a seat, they saw decades of silent bias, generations of exclusion. And suddenly, one child's quiet dignity had opened the door to a larger reckoning. At Skyline Airways, the mood was tense. Marcus had called an emergency all-hands executive meeting at sunrise. Every VP, director, and senior staff member was present, some bleary-eyed from the shock, others defensive, and a few visibly shaken. A large monitor at the front of the conference room displayed multiple windows, Zoe's boarding footage, Patricia's refusal at the lounge, Ashley's bribe exchange, passenger reactions. And in the middle of it all, a paused frame, Zoe standing beside her seat, her small hands gripping her backpack straps, her eyes filled with confusion and resilience. Marcus stepped to the front of the room. He didn't speak for a moment. He Let the silence do what it needed to do. He looked around, locking eyes with every single person. This, he finally said, pointing to the image on the screen, is what we allowed to happen. Not because we're bad people, but because we've grown comfortable, because we stopped looking inward, because we forgot that culture isn't built by policies, it's built by people. He turned to the head of human resources. Effective. Immediately, the following changes will take place. All flight crew will undergo advanced unconscious bias training, not just once, but annually. Ethics violations will no longer be buried under incident reports. They will be reviewed by an external, independent panel. Customer complaints regarding discrimination will be given top investigative priority. Then he paused. And the woman who offered money to displace my daughter? She may not be an employee, but she is a customer. And we will not allow money to outweigh integrity. She is permanently banned from all Skyline flights, effective today. Gasps echoed in the room. Some clapped. Others shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged it. Because the truth was, they all knew this was bigger than one seat. This was about who they were becoming. Meanwhile, back at home, Zoe sat curled up on the couch with her grandmother, watching the television news play the story again. Her grandmother wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're going to change the world, baby girl," she whispered. "And you didn't even raise your voice." Zoe looked up at her. "I didn't mean to cause all this." Her grandmother smiled, soft and wise. "That's the thing about change, baby. It never shows up quietly, and it doesn't ask for permission." Later. That afternoon, a letter appeared online. It was published on Skyline Airways' homepage, printed in full in the New York Times, and read aloud on morning broadcasts across the country. It was titled, "To Every Passenger Who's Ever Felt Unseen," by Marcus Williams, CEO of Skyline Airways. Yesterday, my daughter Zoe was removed from her rightful seat on one of our flights. She was silenced by people who thought she didn't belong simply because of how she looked. She was 8 years old. But Zoe isn't just my daughter. She's every person who has ever been questioned when they walked into a room. Every person who has ever had to prove they earned the space they already occupied. And while I am her father, I am also the leader of the company that failed her. For that, I apologize. Not just to her, but to you. If you have ever felt unwelcome on one of our planes, if you have ever been overlooked or questioned or judged for things that have nothing to do with your boarding pass, I see you. We will do better. Starting now, not just for my daughter, but for yours too. The letter was signed in bold. Underneath it, a new company pledge appeared. Every seat has a story, we promise to listen. Within hours, thousands of comments flooded in. Parents shared their stories. Travelers from all over the world posted images of themselves in first class with the hashtag #Seat2A. Advocacy groups celebrated the bold action, not just because it was public, but because it was meaningful, tangible, real. But the biggest surprise came from Zoe herself. A week after the incident, Marcus sat down with Zoe after dinner. He had just returned from meetings in D.C. and New York, where civil rights groups had asked him to speak about corporate accountability and racial equity. He was tired, but full of pride that Zoe was sitting at the dining table with a notebook, furiously scribbling something. He walked over. "What are you working on?" he asked. Zoe smiled shyly and turned the page toward him. "It was a speech. I wrote something," she said. "Just in case you ever want me to talk to." Marcus read it silently. It was raw. "Beautiful, brave. Would you like to read this in front of people?" he asked. Zoe nodded. "I think maybe other kids should know that it's okay to speak up." Marcus took her hand. "Then let's give you a stage." And so, the girl who once sat silently in seat 2A now stood behind a podium at Skyline's new diversity summit a month later, her braids tied with new ribbons, her voice steady, her story shared, not as a victim, but as a visionary. Her voice reached the world. The lights were warm on Zoe's face as she stood behind the polished wooden podium. A sea of faces stared back at her leaders from across industries, educators, journalists, social workers, young students, and airline executives from around the country. Behind her, on a towering digital display, glowed the words, Diversity in the skies, a new era of inclusion. The conference hall was packed wall to wall, but the air was silent, almost reverent, as the 8-year-old cleared her throat and looked down at the note cards trembling slightly in her hands. But then she paused, breathed in deeply, and slowly set the cards aside. She didn't need them, not anymore. Her story was no longer just in her head or on her father's laptop. It lived in her heart now. Every breath she took carried the weight of that flight, of that seat, of that moment where she had been told, without words, that she didn't belong. And every heartbeat reminded her why she had to speak now. "My name is Zoe Williams," she began softly, her voice echoing through the vast auditorium. "And I didn't know I would change anything when I got on that plane. I just wanted to go home." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a few soft nods, a few tears already forming in the corners of people's eyes. I didn't say anything. When they looked at me like I was in the wrong place. I didn't shout when the woman gave money to take my seat. I didn't even cry when they moved me. I just sat there, quiet, confused, but I remembered what my dad told me: you belong everywhere. Your courage can reach. And that day my courage reached seat 2A, even when they tried to take it away from me. She paused, and the silence in the room deepened, but the seat wasn't just a seat. It was a message that children like me, girls like me, people who don't always look like they belong, do belong. And that nobody gets to decide where we fit except us. I didn't want to be a news story, but maybe the story happened because someone else needed to see it. Maybe another kid out there needed to know they weren't wrong to sit where they were. Told, maybe some grown-ups needed to remember how it feels to be small and still be right. Thunderous applause exploded across the hall before she even finished. Her father stood just off stage, wiping his eyes, his heart bursting with the kind of pride that went deeper than any CEO title or boardroom accolade ever could. What Zoe didn't know was that her words were being live-streamed across classrooms, news networks, and corporate training sessions. Students in public schools from Atlanta to Oakland were watching on projectors. Activists were reposting the clip online with captions like, "This girl just spoke more truth than half of Congress." Airline CEOs from competing carriers, who had quietly dismissed the situation as a skyline issue, now found themselves quoted in stories questioning how they treated passengers, especially those who looked like Zoe, backstage, moments after. Stepping down, Zoe was approached by 3 young girls, one black, one South Asian, one Latina. They couldn't have been much older than she was. The black girl had tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. "I was kicked out of a science club at school because they said I didn't look like a scientist, but you do." Zoe knelt down beside her and took her hand gently. "You are a scientist," she whispered. "And don't let anyone forget it." From that moment, something shifted in Zoe. The weight of what had happened to her was no longer a burden she carried. It became a responsibility she wore proudly. In the days that followed, her name appeared in more places than she could have imagined. A children's book publisher reached out, wanting to turn her story into a picture book. Universities requested that she speak virtually, of course, to share her experience with college students studying education, sociology, and ethics. A well-known tech company asked if she wanted to design a STEM app for girls. Even the White House had taken notice. Within 2 weeks, a letter arrived on Marcus Williams' desk, embossed with the presidential seal, inviting Zoe and her father to Washington, D.C. for a roundtable on youth equity and access. But before that, something else happened, something even more unexpected. One afternoon, as Zoe and Marcus walked through the company's innovation campus, they passed a wall where employees pinned their ideas, dreams, and messages of hope. And there, in the center, someone had printed a photo of seat 2A, framed in gold. Above it was a simple caption in bold, "Reserved for every child who was told you don't belong." Zoe stared at it for a long time. She turned to her father. "Can we keep it there forever?" she asked. Marcus nodded, his voice thick. "We'll never take it down." A few days later, the White House visit became reality. Zoe and Marcus arrived on the South Lawn under soft spring sunlight, greeted by a group of advisors, educators, and youth leaders. She was the youngest in the room by far, but not once did she look out of place. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown on that airplane, and that same poise now captivated political leaders, policy advocates, and community organizers alike. During the roundtable, Zoe didn't speak until asked, but when the First Lady looked at her and gently said, "Zoe, what would you change if you could change one thing for kids like you?" The room hushed once more. Zoe's answer was simple. Not rehearsed, not overthought. Just truth. I'd teach grown-ups to listen better, she said. Because sometimes we're not loud, but we still know things. The room fell into thoughtful silence. That one sentence became the quote on the official briefing the next day. It was shared on the presidential social media account. And more importantly, it started conversations in places where children's voices were often left out. Back home, things changed too. The once quiet girl who loved science books and math competitions now found herself speaking at schools, libraries, and community centers. Zoe didn't seek attention, but it followed her naturally. Parents came with their kids to meet her not because she was famous, but because she had made their children feel seen. A mother in Detroit shared a story of how her biracial daughter finally wore her natural curls proudly after watching Zoe speak. A family in Texas explained how their adopted son refused to sit in the back during story time anymore, saying, "If Zoe sat in front, then so can I." But the most touching moment came at a small school in Newark where Zoe had been invited to speak at a girls' STEM day. After her talk, a quiet student named Amara approached, holding something in her hands. "This is for you," she whispered, handing Zoe a folded paper. Inside was a drawing. A simple crayon sketch of two airplane seats side by side. One labeled, "Me," the other Zoe. And at the top, in bold, shaky handwriting, the words, "My dreams belong here too." Zoe looked up at the girl, tears in her eyes. "Yes, they do," she whispered, hugging her. The story that began with a stolen seat was no longer just about that moment in first class. It had become a movement not driven by rage or revenge, but by the quiet, persistent belief that dignity doesn't need to shout, that sometimes the smallest voices hold the biggest truths. That one girl, sitting where she belonged, could remind a world that belonging isn't earned by wealth, or name, or power, but by humanity. And in the office of Skyline Airways, Marcus Williams had begun to receive letters from other CEOs, some with questions, others with confessions, but all with one theme: how do we do what you did? How do we fix what we didn't even know was broken? He responded to each personally, because the world had watched what happened to his daughter, and now they were ready to change. The resistance, the ripple, and the rising Zoe was never trying to become a symbol. She wasn't trying to start a movement. She was just trying to go home. But history has a way of finding those who are simply being true to themselves and turning them into something bigger. Now, months after her quiet act of resistance on Flight 2275, the world had changed. Not completely, not magically, but undeniably. In classrooms, her name was whispered with admiration. On television, her face was shown not for spectacle, but for substance. And in the places where power once moved in silence, conversations were now loud and uncomfortable. And necessary. But not everyone was happy. With every rising light comes a shadow. The backlash began quietly at first. Opinion columns accusing Marcus Williams of weaponizing his position for personal drama. Comment threads flooded with veiled racism, coded words, and deliberate attempts to shift blame. It was just a misunderstanding, they said. She should have moved quietly. Maybe if she smiled more, it wouldn't have been a problem. Why does everything have to be about race? The most vicious ones were anonymous. But Marcus read them all not out of obsession but responsibility. He needed to know what Zoe would one day face again, and then came the lawsuit. Victoria Harrington, dressed in pearls and armed with the sharpest legal team money could buy, filed a defamation suit against Skyline Airways and Marcus Williams personally. She claimed emotional distress, reputational harm, and loss of social status due to false media portrayal. Her attorneys held press conferences in manicured courtrooms, and phrases like cancel culture victim, privileged scapegoat, and corporate targeting flooded the media circuit. Zoe didn't understand it fully. She just knew the woman who had taken her seat now wanted to take even more. Marcus, though calm on the surface, knew what was at stake. The case wasn't about Victoria. It was about sending a message. It was about making people afraid to speak up, about punishing the Williams family for doing what too many others had been too tired, or too small to do, tell the truth out loud. He stood firm. "We won't settle," he told the board. "This isn't just about my daughter anymore. It's about every child who's been silenced because someone richer said they were too loud." Skyline's legal team, bolstered by a growing community of supporters and civil rights advocates, launched a powerful defense. But even more surprising were the allies who began to step forward. Former passengers on the same flight began submitting affidavits. One woman, a retired teacher, wrote, "I saw it all. I said nothing, I regret it, but I'm speaking now." The elderly black woman, Mrs. Patterson, testified and submitted her original footage, time-stamped and verified. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she simply endured. That's what made it worse. But the true turning point came from the last place anyone expected. It was Gregory Harrington, Victoria's husband, who had remained mostly quiet and distracted throughout the incident, walked into the courthouse during the second hearing wearing a simple gray suit, his expression somber. When asked to take the stand, he cleared his throat and looked directly at the judge. "I didn't pay attention that day," he began. "I was too absorbed in my phone, too detached from the moment. I let my wife take control of a situation I should have spoken up about. And when I saw the video later, when I saw that little girl, I realized I was complicit. I didn't say anything. I watched a lie unfold and said nothing. That makes me guilty too." He paused, then added, "But today I want to say something clearly. My wife was wrong. Zoe belonged in that seat. She belongs in every seat she chooses to take in life." The courtroom was stunned. Victoria's legal team sat frozen. Marcus turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man who had once looked away now stand and face the consequences of silence. And Zoe, sitting quietly beside her grandmother in the back row, reached for her father's hand. "He told the truth," she whispered. Within hours, the case collapsed. The media turned. Victoria withdrew the lawsuit, claiming emotional exhaustion, but it was too late. The story had shifted. The ripple Zoe created had pushed back against every attempt to erase her. In the weeks that followed, Skyline Airways took even bolder steps. They didn't just issue internal reforms, they launched a global campaign. Billboards went up in airports around the world, each one showing a different child seated proudly in first class. Some reading books, some sketching planes, some simply staring out the window with hope in their eyes. The tagline beneath every photo was the same: "Every seat tells a story, make room for all of them." The ad campaign went viral, not because it was catchy, but because it was real, authentic, vulnerable. Airlines across the globe took note. United Airlines publicly announced a new anti-bias training program modeled after Skyline's. British Airways offered to host Zoe as a special guest speaker for their Youth Inclusion Summit in London. Emirates invited her to tour their global training center in Dubai, and the International Air Transport Association sent Marcus a proposal to co-author a global code of conduct for passenger equality, but it wasn't the airline world where Zoe's legacy was being felt most. It was in schools. At Jefferson Elementary in Missouri, teachers used Zoe's speech as part of their morning announcements. At a middle school in Minneapolis, an art teacher painted a mural of Seat 2A on the hallway wall, surrounded by silhouettes of children from every background imaginable. And at a rural library in Mississippi, a group of third-grade girls held a book club where Hidden Figures, Zoe's favorite, was now their first-ever selection. They called themselves the Seat 2A Society. Back in Chicago, Zoe finally returned to something she had missed deeply: normalcy. She went back to school, back to math competitions, back to late-night talks with her dad about constellations and rocket engines, but even normal had changed. Classmates looked at her with quiet awe. Teachers invited her to lead group discussions. And strangers occasionally approached just to say, "You helped my daughter. You made my son feel seen. You changed how I think." And through it all, Zoe remained herself, quiet, thoughtful, grounded. One evening, as the summer wind whispered through the open windows of their home, Marcus sat with Zoe on the porch swing. Fireflies blinked in the distance. The city buzzed low in the background. He looked at her and asked, "If you ever wanted to forget about all this and just be a kid again, I'd understand." Zoe smiled, looking up at the stars. "I do want to be a kid," she said. "But I also want other kids to not go through what I did," Marcus nodded slowly. "You're stronger than I ever was at your age." Zoe leaned into his side. "That's because you gave me your strength." And they sat there in the warm night air, father and daughter, silent but not still. Because though the moment had passed, the mission had not. There were still systems to change. Still voices to amplify, still seats to protect. But now the world had a blueprint, a voice. A name. Zoe Williams. The girl who didn't yell, who didn't beg, who didn't storm. She simply stood, and in standing she moved the world. The flight that changed everything. Autumn had arrived in Chicago. The trees outside Skyline Airways headquarters shimmered in gold and crimson, their leaves dancing in the chilled breeze like sparks of quiet fire. Inside, the mood was reflective, but forward-looking. A new plaque had been installed in the main atrium, carved in brushed steel and framed with polished glass. It read, "Seat 2, a symbol of belonging, courage, and change. May no child ever be asked to shrink for someone else's comfort again." Below the plaque was a replica of the original first-class seat Zoe had been removed from. Except now, it wasn't just a seat, it had become a monument, a quiet reminder for every employee, traveler, and visitor who stepped through those doors that the future of dignity was not a policy, it was a person. And her name was Zoe Williams. 6 months had passed since the incident on Flight 2275. Much had changed, but the world kept spinning forward, faster now with the story Zoe's journey had awakened. And though her life had become unexpectedly public, she hadn't let the spotlight dim her curiosity, her kindness, or her love for discovery. She was still the same girl who stayed up late reading books about rockets and women in science. Still, the same girl who asked big questions at dinner and doodled equations in the margins of her school notes. But now, something had shifted deep within her. Not in how she saw the world, but in how the world saw her. And how it saw other children who looked like her. One crisp October morning, Zoe walked into her classroom holding a slip of paper that had arrived in the mail 2 days earlier. It was an invitation. Not from a company or an activist group, not from a government agency or a global summit. It was from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. They were launching a new permanent exhibit called Voices in the Sky, an interactive installation, honoring pioneers in aviation history who had broken barriers, challenged prejudice, and reshaped the skies for future generations. Alongside names like Bessie Coleman, Amelia Earhart, and Mae Jemison, the curators had added a new section titled "The Seat That Spoke Back." Zoe was invited to cut the ribbon, her. Classmates crowded around the invitation, eyes wide with pride and excitement. Her teacher clapped a hand over her heart. "Zoe," she whispered, "they're putting your story in the Smithsonian?" Zoe simply nodded. I guess it's not just mine anymore." And she was right, because what had started as a private moment of injustice had become a universal anthem. Across the globe, children had adopted her story as their own. Schools in Brazil painted murals of a girl in seat 2A with the words "Voca pertence aqui," you belong here. In South Africa, a youth poetry competition was held around the theme, "Silence is not surrender." In India, girls in remote villages began calling themselves Zoe Clubs, dedicated to sharing books, helping each other speak up, and practicing leadership. And in airports from Tokyo to Toronto, passengers began noticing small brass plaques attached to select first-class seats. They read, "This seat is reserved for dignity, for belonging, for everyone When Zoe and Marcus flew to DC for the exhibit's unveiling, the airline didn't fly them on a private jet, even though they could have. Instead, Marcus booked 2 first-class tickets under the standard process. No names flagged, no VIP alerts. Just a father and daughter taking a flight like everyone else. When they arrived at their gate, something extraordinary happened. The airline staff recognized the name but didn't treat it as royalty. Instead, they came forward, looked Zoe in the eye, and said softly, "Thank you." Nothing more, just 2 words. But in them lived a universe of meaning. The ribbon-cutting ceremony at the Smithsonian drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Students from schools around the country had come, aviation historians, educators, civil rights leaders, airline CEOs, even flight attendants who had resigned in protest after seeing the original video were in attendance, wearing pins on their lapels that read, "I believe in seat 2A." Zoe stood next to the red velvet ribbon in her favorite navy dress and purple ribbon braids. Her speech was short but unforgettable. "I never wanted to be famous," she said, standing under the wings of a real airplane hanging from the museum ceiling. "I just wanted to be heard. When they took my seat, they thought they were moving a child. But what they really moved was a mirror that showed how easily people forget that fairness isn't about money or power. It's about listening." I didn't scream. I didn't argue. But I didn't disappear either. And now, this story isn't about what was taken. It's about what we all gave back: space. Space to belong, space to dream, space to rise. The crowd stood in thunderous applause. Her father, standing a few feet away, had tears running silently down his cheeks. A woman next to him leaned over and whispered, "She's already done more for justice than most adults ever will." That night, Zoe and Marcus sat beneath the stars on a rooftop hotel balcony, overlooking the Capitol dome, the moon glowing silver in the sky. They didn't talk much, just shared warm tea and quiet company. After a while, Zoe asked, "Daddy, do you think things will really change forever?" Marcus looked at her carefully before answering. "I think forever starts with someone deciding today matters, and you did that." "That's how forever begins," Zoe nodded. She believed him, but what she didn't know, what no one knew, was how far her story would truly travel. Years later, a little girl in a village outside Nairobi would tell her teacher, "I don't care if they say I can't be a pilot. Zoe sat in that seat. Now I will too." A boy in Texas who had stopped talking after years of bullying would find the courage to speak in front of his class again because he'd seen a girl who refused to be made small. And a future CEO, still just a child building paper planes in her backyard, would remember the story of a girl who never needed to raise her voice to raise the world. Zoe's name would one day be taught in schools. Her story would be written in textbooks, not because she wanted it, but because the world needed it. And the flight she took as a scared little girl would forever be remembered as the journey that grounded an industry and lifted a movement. As for seat 2A, it's still there, but now, whenever someone sits in it, they're greeted by a small silver card tucked into the seat pocket. It reads, "This seat once belonged to Zoe Williams." She didn't shout, she didn't run. She simply stayed where she was meant to be, and because of that, so can you. And somewhere, in the sky above, a new flight takes off. A child looks out the window, dreams bigger, sits taller, and belongs without question.